Well, Asia-Pacific markets are tracking Wall Street's gains overnight as investors await progress on efforts to end the war in the Middle East. Here's a look at how they're faring this hour with Nikkei up a touch. Australia extending those gains, in fact, up by more than 2.3%, while Singapore's STI also up about 0.2% right now. Looking at South Korea's Kospi, it is up about 1.8%, boosted by Samsung Electronics, which is climbing more than 3% there. That's after it flagged an eightfold on-year increase in its operating profit from January to March, as booming demand for AI chips caused supply snags and drove prices higher. Now, while the growing demand for AI chips has resulted in a memory chip crunch that is only getting worse, and the shortage has hit corporate profits and increased the prices of consumer devices at a time when inflation concerns are already high. Sarah Kaldi is here to tell us more about that. I think the question is if we're going to be seeing higher prices for our electronic devices.
Yeah, and in some ways, we're already seeing that now. We've got Apple increasing the price of their high-end computers by about $100 to $400. You've got Dell, Lenovo. They're also hiking laptop prices by about 20 to 25%. And this really boils down to what's being called now as Ramageddon. This is strong demand for AI data centers, and that's mopping up the available memory chip supply. So you could think of it this way, that AI is a chef, and the bigger the counter space it has, the more tasks it can do, the more complex jobs it can take on, and the faster it is. Now, that counter space is really memory chips. So you can imagine how many, memory power AI servers need. In fact, one large AI server uses as much memory as 1,000 high-end smartphones. Plus, remember that AI is much more profitable for these memory makers. So suppliers are now focusing on selling to AI customers, leaving fewer supplies for the rest. And that is causing this squeeze for device makers such as those who do laptops, smartphones, even cars are struggling to get their hands on memory chips. So we've seen prices shoot up about 50% in the last quarter of 2025 for these chips. It's estimated to have jumped another 40 to 50% in the first quarter. And Liz, some memory chips are even jumping as much as 75% just in 1 month.
Yeah, I'm going to take a closer look at this crunch now with Mehdi Hosseini, his senior equity research analyst at Susquehanna International Group. So, Mehdi, thanks for your time today. So it seems that we won't be seeing an increased supply of chips anytime soon. And I wonder how the current geopolitical situation is shaping the semiconductor chain and the risks this year. We talk about instability, the surging prices of critical materials as well, really adding pressure. And how is this current memory chip cycle different from previous disruptions?
Sure. There were multiple questions in your question. Let me start by differentiating memory chips that go into the AI application. These are very large memory chips. They could be 5 times bigger than a memory chip going to consumer devices. So the silicon and the silicon consumption by AI is enormous. And in that context, you're seeing a significant capacity allocation to AI application. Now, for AI, customers are willing to pay. Prices on a blended basis were up 100% for DRAM in Q1. I think you highlighted 75. I actually argue that DRAM prices were up 100% in Q1, and it's tracking to up 50% in Q2. On the consumer side, I think the high-end smartphone and notebook are able to absorb and pass on the extra cost to their customer. The segment that is going to be feeling most pressure is the low-end smartphone and notebook. And when you think about those devices, there isn't really much of an innovation there. So I'm not really that concerned with the low-end smartphone and notebook. And I think for the first time, the AI needs more memory. And this is one of these super cycles that are driving memory economics much higher. Just to answered the other part of your question, which has to do with memory supply chain. Right now, if I were to look at Micron, based in US, they are tracking to gross margins of 80 to 85%. This is an all-time gross margin. We have never had this kind of a margin, primarily due to higher prices. Now, do the geopolitical crisis or the geopolitics have an impact on memory production? I think these companies have enough supply. If the crisis in the Persian Gulf were to sustain for months and months, I think it would eventually have an adverse impact on the supply of raw chemical. But as it stands right now, the recent geopolitical crisis is not really having an impact unless it were to sustain for months.
Mehdi, memory chips are really dominated by three main companies: Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. But if customers are willing to pay, will we see other chip makers fill the gap, especially Chinese companies?
No, the short answer is no. There is restriction on YMTC, China's largest NAND manufacturer. CXMT also has some restriction, but they basically are constrained with the leading edge equipment. The Korean Samsung and Hynix and Micron in US, Kioxia in Japan, and also SanDisk in US, they are a couple of generations ahead of Chinese manufacturers. I do think that China is going to be able to make more chips for local domestic consumption and some for export, but primarily those chips are going to be supplied for a notebook and a smartphone. I think when it comes to AI, Koreans, Japanese, and US companies are still dominating.
Yeah, and we've also heard Google's TurboQuest. They say it can make memory chips more efficient by up to 6 times. Does that mean demand for memory will fall when this algorithm is widely adopted?
I think what you're referring to is kind of the Google as a major hyperscaler, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft Azure. They're all trying to procure more memory. When we have this kind of shortage, you do come across these white papers try to remedy the shortage. But at the end of the day, some of these technologies that were referenced in that white paper has been around for years. Storage companies have been trying to use those technique to reduce the demand or requirement for memory. But I don't think those are going to have a big impact. I think AI is driving significant growth in demand for DRAM and NAND, and I think this is going to sustain through mid-27. I see the supply and demand coming in balance by mid-27, but before that, we're going to have shortage.
Yeah, well, there is also the issue of gray market supply. That's when, of course, the legitimate supply is constrained. But I wonder how this sort of illicit trade perhaps could distort pricing or even availability in the, I suppose, the legitimate semiconductor supply chain.
Well, there's always, if I heard your question correctly, there's always a channel. There are players that look for arbitrage opportunity, buy a chip at a low price and sell it at a high price. I think NVIDIA chips faces some of those constrained with the channel. That's inherent to the semiconductor industry. And one of the reasons that cycles overheat are these arbitrage, the channel players that try to buy low and sell high. But I think given the fact that we're just capacity limited, I don't think these channel players are going to have an impact. But if you look to mid-27, when incremental capacity comes online, I do worry about these channel players then, but we still have a year till that point.
All right, Mehdi, really appreciate your time today. Mehdi Hosseini there, he's Senior Equity Research Analyst at Susquehanna International Group.